Good afternoon, Charles Moscowitz. I'm back for part two of today's programming. And my guest this segment is Keith Whittington. He is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He's the author of Speak Freely, While Universities Must Defend Free Speech, and also more recently, Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present. Keith, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Keith, you seem to have a great deal of emphasis on studying the history of constitutional law and politics in the United States. So I'd like to focus on that a bit, if you don't mind, in light of obviously what's going on with the pandemic right now. And
Sure.
What are your thoughts in terms of how the executive is handling this versus the states? There's a lot of controversy around that. I think you have some people, quite frankly, on the liberal side of the spectrum who want national, the equivalent of martial law, it seems to me. Whereas this president seems to be operating under a more traditional conservative approach, which is to delegate authority or recognize the authority of the states and acting as a supporting partner. So where do you fall on how things are going in this situation, particularly constitutionally speaking?
Yeah, well, certainly traditionally, public health crises are something that's dealt with at the state and local level. That's where the Constitution fundamentally entrusts the authority to engage in the kinds of measures that are necessary to deal with public health crises is at the state and local level. We have not, fortunately, had to deal with lots of epidemics in relatively recent American history, but earlier in American history, we did routinely deal with epidemics, and those were traditionally dealt with by state and local officials who put in place laws designed precisely to address those. There's still a role for the federal government to play, I think, particularly in this context where we have a global pandemic, a nationwide epidemic. It raises some particular issues for the federal government to deal with. For example, whether or not people who are infectious should be able to come into the United States. The ability to close the international borders is something the president has the authority to do, the federal government has the authority to do, the states don't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things that you would naturally expect the federal government to be able to do, and to some degree the federal government's doing it now. But you'd expect the states really to be taking a leadership role, taking the most active measures, making the most fundamental decisions about how to respond, and they happen.
Now, one of the criticisms I've heard of this particular approach, which is entirely within the purview of the Constitution, is that you have states competing for limited supplies, the PPE and the ventilator and whatnot, and even a situation where apparently I think it was the federal government seizing PPE when it landed in Baltimore, where the governor actually had the National Guard accompanying the arrival of it and then escorting it so that the federal government, not to mention hoarders and criminals, could seize it. So isn't that kind of an unusual situation where you have the federal government and the states competing?
Yeah, it's an unusual situation, and this is probably unfortunate in an area where the federal government, I think, could be doing a better job. There are some statutes in place that would allow the federal government to prioritize its own procurement of necessary supplies, which it could then redirect to the states. And so you could have the federal government playing a more active role in trying to coordinate some of these purchases, trying to make sure that some of the necessary materials get to the places where there are most immediate demands in the current situation. I think the Trump administration has probably tried to cede authority too much in this particular area and really encouraged the states to be on their own on this when the federal government could be more helpful on this particular front.
And you have, in a sense, the clear demonstration of state authority in this pandemic. And it's interesting to watch how that's played out here in my own state of Massachusetts, which we assume is a pretty liberal state. Nevertheless, it's been pretty moderate here. We have a governor who's a Republican, and we've had essentially the local communities just have a great deal of authority. I mean, Massachusetts is a commonwealth, and that's different than other states in that that means that the local cities and towns have a lot more sovereignty and a lot more direct power. And so you have cities and towns who are implementing things like you have to wear a mask in public or whatnot, whereas other cities and towns don't because they don't have this kind of a crisis. But you have other states like Michigan where you have a governor implementing very strong laws. You cannot travel in a car with more than one person. You can't leave your home. And it's a state where a recent guest pointed out to me, there's only 2 counties that have a major problem with the pandemic. So you have other parts of the state like the Upper Peninsula where they have no cases at all. And you have a governor coming in and literally imposing a complete lockdown. And so you have almost you have big protests going on. So I guess my question for you, Keith, is as a constitutional expert, what are the state authorities in terms of how to cope with this crisis, and how far can the states go?
I think this is really untested, and we may be pushing the boundaries to see just how expansive state authority is in this sense. Partially, the current pandemic is extraordinary, and there's a lot of unknowns about it. And as a consequence, it has sort of forced the states to exercise kinds of powers they would not have traditionally exercised that weren't necessary in more traditional situations. And so, historically, when we dealt with epidemics, the goal would be you identify who is infectious, and then you quarantine them. And so it has dramatic consequences for individual liberty for certain individuals who often were subject to mandatory testing regardless of their consent, and subject to isolation orders regardless of their consent. That's a dramatic power on the part of the state. But the upside of that in the traditional context was you knew who the infected were. And so the targets were relatively limited. What's very unusual about this situation is we don't know who's infected. People are infectious for periods when they're not obviously sick. And that's really required the government to try to make a much more sweeping set of orders than would normally be the case, even in serious public health crises. There's also a lot of uncertainty as to when it's appropriate to lift these things. And so traditionally, courts have been very deferential to public health officials, for example, on what exactly is necessary to deal with particular public health crises. Courts were very reluctant to get in the way if a public health official said, these people need to be tested, these people need to be quarantined, here's the steps we need to take. In this context, though, this goes on for weeks and months. Eventually, you can imagine about are some of these really dramatic measures really necessary? And even if some of these things were justified early on, are they still justifiable now? And so I think there is an ongoing requirement, really, that courts will increasingly insistent on, that government officials be able to justify their particular actions and be able to explain why it is not only was this an appropriate thing to do 2 months ago, 3 months ago, but it's still an appropriate thing to do now, and it's still actually helpful in addressing the actual public health emergency.
Well, I think in this case, the federal government and the president have acted appropriately as a sort of a what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. They've put out directives or suggestions to the states that they can begin to reopen in 3 phases after they've had 2 weeks of dropping numbers of hospitalizations, and that they look at the pandemic primarily as a problem by which hospitals can be overwhelmed. And so I'm hoping that is the case, and yet it's astonishing to see the amount of actual, I guess you'd say fiat power, but I suppose it's constitutional power on the state level for states to control these things and to put forth these rules. And I guess that you've touched on this, Keith, that the real problem is to identify people who have the illness, and the way to do that is to increase testing, which is apparently a very difficult thing to do. I mean, it's not developing these tests is taking a huge effort. It's not a given. I mean, and even when they have them, it's not necessarily an ironclad thing. So, but what amazes me is just this incredible governmental power on the part of the states. And this is like a real assertion of states' rights in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, of course, crises are where you see government power being exercised. And in this kind of crisis, I think it's not totally surprising that we see states in particular exercising dramatic authority. part of what's unusual about the situation is how long lasting it is. So not only how sweeping it is, but also how long it goes on. So yeah, I think we're much more familiar with imagining governors exercising these kinds of emergency powers in the context of a hurricane, an earthquake, something along those lines, where you have a limited area that's affected. It's affected for a limited amount of time. Governors can impose really draconian restrictions on individual liberty in those contexts. But they don't last very long, and they don't affect a large number of people. And it's sort of obvious in the context that, of course, you need to restrict people in the midst of an earthquake, for example, and immediate cleanup after the earthquake. What's unusual about this situation, of course, is we're not certain when we're past the crucial moments. You're not certain whether or not your state's really at risk. This thing goes on for weeks and months. And so it really requires or at least invites the governors to continue to try to exercise powers that have never really been exercised with this kind of scope and duration. That's hard to justify. And eventually, I think there'll be a lot of political pushback that will force governors to try to back off on this. And I think one of the things we really, of course, don't know very well is to what degree the infection rates likely bounce back once you start lifting restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the worry about the federalism response, is the worry about this in general, that if some states where they think they don't have much infection right now take a relatively modest approach while other states are trying to crack down, is the result that you just wind up having infections increasing and spreading across state borders. And I just think we don't know the answer to that.
No, we don't. And I mean, I would hope that we can trust individuals to operate safely, and it sort of reminds me of the laws of driving. You know, we drive carefully, we obey those laws because we don't want to get killed or we don't want to kill someone else. And I would think that the same principle would apply here. You know, when you go out, nobody wants to catch this horrible disease. So you take the necessary precautions, and if you happen to be in a high risk category, you self-isolate because you want to live. So I would think that the free market or the free paradigm would be the best, certainly once the thing starts to go into decline. Now, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, grants Congress the power to tax and the power to coin currency, to coin money. And in that capacity, they've borrowed trillions of dollars or created trillions of dollars out of bonded debt and out of going to the Federal Reserve in order to have programs to help businesses continue to function by getting loans, and if they keep their employees, then those loans can turn into grants. The program has been enacted inefficiently, and I think that's just part of the way government works. So you get big players grabbing up the money and that kind of thing. It's unfortunate, but you have Senate Majority Whip or Leader Mitch McConnell recently say that the states that are poorly managed will have to go bankrupt because the federal government isn't going to continue to print up money, and because these states, all states, I think their primary source of revenue is sales tax, and sales is down, so they are going bankrupt. So where does the balance come into play in that regard?
It is a serious question, right? I mean, that the way the constitutional structure is instituted, the states and the federal government both have their independent taxing authority, and the assumption is they both take care of themselves from that financial perspective. Obviously, across the 20th century, the federal government has become much more willing to create grants to the states, and states have become much more dependent on federal sources of funding than they once were. And so the federal government winds up in practice having more of a role in helping support the states financially than once was the case. But this situation does put serious consequences on the states and their ability to raise tax revenue. It's true, of course, for the federal government as well. I think the federal government has more capacity to respond to the fact that their tax revenue is going to be down than states are going to do. So I think states are going to be in a real bind, and it's going to be a difficult issue to figure out how to address that. I do think that the government will, at the end of the day, wind up having some role in helping out the state governments, just like they've had some role in trying to help out individuals and businesses, in part because the federal government has the capacity to do that in ways that states don't. Um, but there's going to be serious lingering fiscal consequences for this, probably at the state level, certainly at the federal level, going forward. It's unfortunate the federal government didn't have its fiscal house better in order when we reached this crisis, because this is actually one of those moments when you exactly need the federal government to be engaged in serious steps of spending to deal with this kind of crisis. And yet, of course, we already had a massive debt going in.
That's right. But yet the economy was pretty robust going into the thing. And, it seems to me that they cannot possibly continue to print money and go into debt, because if they do, the dollar is going to be questioned in terms of its value. So the states are going to ultimately, I think, have to tighten their belt in certain ways. And I think they could do that if they have the political will in such a way that it doesn't actually hurt people, at least not, citizens. It might hurt some government employees, but, there's going to have to be a couple of excesses that are reined in a little bit. And I think that McConnell said something that's probably not too popular in some of the big states, but is true, in that they have not efficiently managed their own budgets, and that they're going to have to take a look at it. And ultimately, they are going to have to take a look at it. You can't have the federal government bail them out constantly.
Yeah, there's clearly going to be a lot of belt tightening for all of us, really.
That's right.
Out of this, certainly, my own university is engaged in it. My own household is engaged in it, and the states are not going to be immune to that. They're going to have to do some belt tightening as well. And there is a fundamental issue in the long term that you can't print money forever.
That's right.
You can't borrow money forever. Eventually, you have to be able to raise money and actually produce goods, which means ultimately you need to get the economy back up and running. And of course, one of the things we have a great deal of uncertainty about right now is how quickly the economy will get back up and running. It's one of the really striking things about our current situation is we did have an economy that was humming along at basically at full employment, doing extremely well, and then we just dramatically shut it down. And we're in an unprecedented situation and try to figure out how well can you get that thing launched again and get back to the kind of strong economy that we had just a few months ago. And of course, our hope is you can do that pretty quickly, but I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, it does. And obviously, we will hopefully be all looking back at this thing, and hopefully soon, because every day the economy is shut down, it's going to be a bigger problem in terms of people getting hurt. And maybe we'll look back and we'll look at the model of Sweden, where they did not shut down their economy and they did isolate people who were vulnerable. And I don't know quite how it's doing over there, but I think that it's probably not that dramatically different than economies that did shut down, because I'm assuming people are taking appropriate precautions. Who knows? I mean, we'll all see after the fact. But Keith, my question to you, and by the way, again, you are professor at Tufts, professor of politics. You're the author of Speak Freely, which I mean, great book. I didn't really want to talk about it today because, I mean, there's no school at all. I mean, maybe another time, maybe when school's back. But right now, I want to talk to you about constitutional issues. What do you see, post-bellum, so to speak, after this episode in terms of the short and the long-term impact on our constitutional system?
Well, I think we have some real unknowns that we don't know yet what some of the long-term impact is going to be. I think the best case scenario is that we have what is a passing public health crisis that goes away. And once the crisis is over, you lift a lot of these restrictions, a lot of the government powers, then go back to something that looks more normal. And we get past this without a serious aggrandizement of the government and without serious permanent restrictions on individual liberty. The less happy scenario, though, is the possibility that what we start imagining is well, now of course, the really bad case scenario is if we can't get a handle on this particular pandemic and actually bring this under control. And of course, there's uncertainty about how well we'll ever be able to successfully test this and how well we'll ever be able to successfully have vaccinations for this, in which case this could be a very long-term issue about how we deal with this particular infection. But I think the other serious issue is trying to think about, is this really what we think is the leading edge of a series of these kinds of pandemics that we're likely to encounter in the future? And to the extent that that's what the government thinks, you can imagine them putting into place a regime that's really designed to anticipate and deal with that. And that's going to significantly increase governmental power and have some real implications for individual liberty down the road. So if the government thinks we need to be better prepared for the next one of these by having, for example, better capacity to test and trace individuals very quickly, which in fact I think is one successful way of dealing with an epidemic like this. But one consequence of that is, in order to seriously test and trace people in the way that South Korea did or Singapore did, for example, in heading this off, it requires a lot of surveillance of individuals and a lot of serious restrictions then on the privacy rights of individuals more generally. And there's a real question, I think, going forward, whether or not Americans will have the kind of tolerance for that kind of ongoing surveillance that would really be necessary to have the state sort of feel like we're up and running and we can jump into action on a moment's notice if we see one of these kinds of things coming along in the future. And I don't think it's clear now to what extent the states are going to want to try to respond that way. And it's not clear, I think, how tolerant Americans will be building that kind of state capacity. There's a bit of a question of likewise after 9/11, sort of what is the war on terror going to look like and what kinds of restrictions on individuals and what kinds of growth of the government is going to be necessary to fight this ongoing war. And there's a similar issue, I think, in this context as well. Is there's sort of basically an ongoing public health war that we're going to be fighting. And is that how we understand ourselves? And if so, what do we think is going to be necessary to fight that? And you could imagine something that results in a pretty aggressive state that is pretty active in monitoring individuals and their movements in order to try to head off future public health crises. And that looks like a different America than what we're used to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that the 9/11 event led to a set of laws, I mean, the USA Patriot Act, which caused serious restrictions on travel in and outside the United States. This situation may result in laws that deal with domestic freedoms. You know, it's kind of like what former chief of staff to Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Of course, I'm talking from a left perspective here. And, you know,
there's certainly that, right? I mean, and certainly some people, I think, will try to take advantage of the situation, right? So the part of what happens in this sort of don't let a good crisis go to waste kind of argument is I've got a pre-existing political agenda and let me take advantage of this opportunity to try to impose it. And we see some of that happening on both the political left and the political right right now.
That's right.
Certainly, I think we should want to resist that. I think
well, in a time of crisis, when people are frightened, that they might be more amicable to that. And the longer we're locked inside, and especially with younger people who don't understand the Constitution and don't understand the whole concept of freedoms as being inherent and not given by the state, you know, there are some real dangers involved. And I hope that it can be treated going forward as a medical problem and as a disease, not as a political problem. I mean, maybe I don't know how optimistic I am that might happen, but that's the hope, you know.
That is the hope, and we'll see. I mean, I think it's I think there's just a lot of uncertainty about what this winds up looking like down the road. I think part of it will turn on what we think the threat assessment looks like going forward, and I think a little bit also trying to evaluate how the different countries respond, as well as to how the different states inside the U.S. respond to this, and who seem more successful and who seem less successful. And so I think if we walk away from this looking around and saying, well, it looks like Singapore actually had the best way of dealing with this, given all the various responses, I think there's going to be a rush to try to model ourselves after that. And that's a pretty aggressive interventionist kind of response. On the other hand, if we look around and say, you know, actually you could deal with this in much more modest ways, areas in other countries like Greece or Sweden, for example, were relatively successful from that perspective, then it leads to different lessons. And so,
Yes.
hopefully people will look around and try to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and what might be necessary going forward. And then we can have a more fact-based discussion about what our choices are going forward.
All right, Keith, could you give out any information you'd like to mention to my listeners and viewers regarding your books or websites that you'd like to direct us to?
Sure. So, as you say, I do work on American constitutional law and history issues in general. I blog regularly at the Volokh Conspiracy, which is hosted by the Reason Magazine website. I may maintain my own website at Princeton, where I post things both for a public audience as well as my more purely academic work. And as you know, two of my recent books, Speak Freely, which is on campus free speech issues, and Repugnant Laws, which is on the history of judicial review of acts of Congress across American history.
All right, Keith Whittington, I want to thank you for joining me. I'd like to have you back sometime to talk other issues, and be safe, and thanks so much.
Yep, stay healthy.
All right, you too. All right, Keith, I'll send you the link once it's up on YouTube. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yep, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.